We're now up to Daf Chav Gimel. The Gemara on Daf Chav Beis had quoted Rava, who asked, "Why do we need this pasuk as an exclusion for Tchilas Tziyuv?" Now the Gemara is going to reject Rava and say we need the pasuk, but not for Tchilas Tziyuv, because Tchilas Tziyuv is certainly, going to be treated as a suffix, and we'll have to exclude it and disqualify it in any event. I don't need a pasuk for that because I don't know whether Tchilas Tziyuv is like Tzahav or not. But rather, ki yitzur kra lemuute nirva v'nevad. Now we're going to go through a whole sugya to explain why I might think that with regard to birds, as opposed to animals, a nirva or a nevad would be kosher. Because we know that in animals, we cannot use an animal that has a mum, and whether it was in cases where it was nevad or nirva, it becomes a balas mum. And we're going to try to analyze whether that set of rules applies to ophos, to birds. In animals, we know. Salke daitramina, I would have thought that to exclude nirva and nevad. We'll explain what nirva and nevad is as we go along. Is holuk sivki mashchasam bohem mumbam. The entire psul of mashchasam means hashchasa. We're going to see that the word hashchasa in biblical Hebrew refers to either a nevad or a nirva, but it's all based on the fact that mashchasam mumbam. They are, so to speak, derivatives or subcategories of mum. Vitana to Bei Rebbe Yishmael. Kol makom shenemar hashchasa ein el dvar erva ve'avodas kol chavim. So now we're going to get an insight into what nirva is and what avodas kol chavim is. So nirva is what we call sodomy. So a human being, a man or a woman, had a relationship with an animal, and avodas kol chavim means that somebody worshipped an animal, which sounds crazy, but I don't know, probably billions of people on the face of this planet that worship animals. Anyway, so these two categories of dvar erva and avodas kol chavim are considered like balas mum, and therefore they're excluded. And where do we see that the word hashchas is referring to, some sort of sexual deviation, dvar erva? Because the chsiv in the Mabul, it says ki hishchis kol basar dar kol haaretz. And that's a reference to min b'sheino mino, some sort of a sexual aberration, whatever it is, a corruption. And avodas kol chavim, because ichsiv pen tashchisu v'asisim lochem pesel. So you see the word hashchas is referring to a getchka. Kol shahamum posilbo. So this category of erva or avodas kol chavim are subsets of mum, because the Torah compares it to mum. So in an animal, there's a psul called a mum. A balas mum is posel mizbeach. Is therefore dvar erva avodas kol posel. But kol she'ein mum posel. We're going to see that in birds, there's no such thing as mum. The whole entity of a blemish as a disqualification only applies to animals but not to birds. It's ein dvar erva avodas kol posel. Mahani ofos hovelo posel b'muma. There's no psul of mum in ophos, and therefore, ipso facto, we would have assumed logically, if not for the pasuk, that there's no psul of dvar erva or avodas kol chavim. Diomar mar tamus v'zachrus b'behema v'ein tamus v'zachrus b'ophos. Right? Tamus refers to a perfect animal without a mum, and zachrus means that, in regard to animals, the Torah very often requires a sa'ir, etc., means like a male goat. It's therefore, since in ophos there's no such thing, neither of, its gender nor of a blemish. All those concepts are totally inapplicable to ophos. Is therefore, I would come to the conclusion logically that dvar erva avodas kol chavim nami lo lifsol bo, because again these are two subcategories of mum. Is kamash malan. Therefore, I need the pasuk to teach me that although ophos are kosher lemizbeach, in the case of, let's say, an olasov, or in the case of chatasov. But if it was a nirva or a nevad, it's possible. And that's what I need from the word min. You remember we quoted the pasuk in Vayikra that says min hatorim or min b'nei Yona, which we said min means amongst them to exclude others, coming to exclude a nirva or a nevad. Now, exactly how you could have a sexual act with a bird, I'm not exactly sure. But I don't know. I'm not familiar with the biology of a bird, but I guess whatever. Anyway, boy Reb Zera. Now, once we have this concept of a birya, then we're going to apply this concept to the case of the transition between a keves and an ayal. A keves is a young sheep, and an ayal, or let's call it a lamb, maybe that's a better word than sheep, I'm sorry. And an ayal is a ram. A ram is a mature lamb. And the difference is 12 months, during which it's called a keves. And then when it enters into the 14th month, meaning after the 13th month, then it becomes an ayal. Boy Rab Zera ha'omer hareo lai olas behema min ayal o min keves. His pledge for a nedava expands to include two possibilities. He's allowing himself one or the other, either an ayal or a keves. Behevi palgas. Palgas, miloshen polig, meaning it splits between a keves and an ayal. That's during its 13th month. In Yiddish, we'd say it's nishtaher and nishtahin. Actually, nishtahin is a play on words here because a lot of it has to do with a hin, as we'll soon see. Anyway, mahu. Now, l'chora, a palgas is either a keves or it's an ayal. It's not a non-entity. And he brought both. Just 1 second. No, I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. That he brought both. That he pledged both, meaning one or the other. Now, a palgas, either you'll tell me it's still immature and it belongs to the state of a keves, or you'll tell me, which is possible, that it's more mature than a keves and it's an ayal, but it's one of the two. And if it's one of the two and he brought both, then mimanav shach, he fulfilled his obligation. So what was Reb Zera's suffix? And the answer is Reb Zera raised the possibility in his mind that a palgos is nishtaher nishtahin, it's a birya. It's an entity unto itself. So therefore, palgas is not an ayal, nor is it a keves, and therefore he cannot fulfill his obligation. And the Gemara says the following: we have a machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and other Amoraim, and the Gemara says, "I'll leave it to Rabbi Yochanan lo tiboylach diyama birya havi." Rabbi Yochanan, in the context of Para Duma, a Mishnah in Masechta Para, commits himself to the position that a palgas is a birya, and therefore in this case of Reb Zera, he would not be yotze. What does it say in the Mishnah in Para? Hikrivo. The Mishnah is talking about someone who brought as a korban ola a palgas, and now Rabbi Yochanan is going to interpret the Mishnah in a tzvei dinim, literally like a brisker. Why? Because we have two different dimensions of the issue. One dimension is, did he fulfill his nidava, his pledge? Meaning, is the palgos an ayal or a keves? And then we have another additional issue about the menachos and the nesachim, because the menachos and the nesachim split or divide up into two sets of numbers, depending upon whether you have an ayal or a keves. So listen carefully, and we'll get back to the numbers in a second. Is if he went ahead, and he shouldn't have done this. Well, actually, I blame the Kohen for doing this. And the Kohen went ahead and he was makriv the palgos. He shouldn't have done that, but he did it. Now what happens? Does the noder have to now replace it? Because if palgas is neither ayal nor keves, then mimanav shach he wasn't yotze. And that's, I'm just skipping a few words for a second, ein ololo mizivcho. He has not fulfilled his pledge. But yet, and here's the second din, the second dimension, mevi olav niskei ayal. In other words, the Torah, with regard to nisachim and menachos, is going to take the palgas and grade it or define it as an ayal. And where do we see this? Says Rabbi Yochanan, how did the Mishnah come to this conclusion that as far as the nisachim are concerned, that are meant to accompany the voluntary korban olah, we consider a palgas an ayal, because it says o la ayal, and the word o is superfluous, la ravos es a palgas. Let me just see if I have the pasuk here. It says, Ola ayal tase mincha soles shnei esronim blula b'shemen shlosha shlishis hahid. So let's quickly go over this. So we're talking about nesachim and we're talking about menachos. With regard to a keves, the Torah says you need a revius hahin for the niskei yayin. You need a saron of soles mixed with a revius hahin of shemen in order to get the mincha. In the case of an ayal, however, the Torah says you need a shlishis hin of yayin. So we're jacking it up now in the case of an ayal, which is an older, more mature, more choshev animal, that we need not just a quarter of a hin of yayin, but we need a shlish hin of yayin, a full third. And instead of one isaron of solos, you need two isronos. And instead of a reva hin of shemen, you need a shlishis revin of shemen. So basically, I mean, just as a mnemonic device to remember this, ayal is always greater, both in terms of niskei yayin and in terms of the menachos, vis-a-vis a keves. And another mnemonic device could be that it always goes from 1/3 to, I'm sorry, from 1/4 up to 1/3, or from 1 isaron up to 2 isaron. So yeah, you have to figure it out. Anyway, in the parsha of Niskei Yayin, the Torah says, Ola ayal. Actually, it's the parsha of the mincha that accompanies it. Anyway, it says, Ola ayal. Comes along Rabbi Yochanan, says, L'ravos es hapalgos. So again, it comes out that according to Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation of the Mishnah excludes a palgas entirely as far as the zevach is concerned. He was not yotze his pledge, even though, right, he pledged either or, but it's an entity unto itself, and it's a birya, and therefore it's chayev the nisachim and the menachos of an ayal. But kiti boilach aliba devar pada. What was Bar Pada's Shita against Rabbi Yochanan? Domer Maisei Umasne. Okay, Maisei Umasne. That's going to be our subject here on the next Amud. Let me just